This is episode 40 of the Life in Norway show. Today I'm joined by Keith Ruiter, a researcher in the Viking Ages and Middle Ages. We talk about the importance of researching historical time periods and just how we go about doing that, why learning languages, including how to read Old Norse, is so important to the work, and what questions are still to be answered. You can find out more information on today's show on the show notes page over at lifeinnorway.net/podcast. Just look for episode 40. Happy listening. I'm joined today by Keith Ruiter. Keith is an assistant professor in Viking and early medieval English studies at the University of Nottingham. Keith, welcome to the show.
Thanks, David.
First question, I didn't realise before we started recording that you're from Canada originally. So what brings someone from Canada to England to study medieval Scandinavia?
That's kind of a series of fun accidents, to be totally honest. I got interested in Scandinavia through a rather knee-jerk decision in my undergrad at the University of Alberta. Faculty of Arts requires a language other than English. And so I kind of looked through the course guide, found a few things that looked really interesting, but Swedish fit really nicely in my schedule. And I figured I'd give it a try. And one thing kind of led to another. I found that I was really interested in the language. I was really interested in the history and the cultural aspects and the literature. And I actually ended up splitting my degree into a double major then, English and then Scandinavian languages and literatures. And then as I just tumbled down the rabbit hole, opportunity came for studying in the UK, and that's kind of brought me here, and I've hung out in a few different universities now, just continuing to tumble down that rabbit hole.
Interesting. Okay. So on a recent show, I had Knut, who is a Viking ship archaeologist here in Norway, and I asked him this question as well. Why is it so important to research and study things that happened 1,000 years ago or so? Why is that relevant to today?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's a few different ways of looking at this. And I think one of the ones that we hear quite often is, by looking at the past, we can know where we've been and we can have a better idea of where we're going. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So, for instance, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These are kind of strategic areas that the UN has highlighted as kind of the challenges of the present day and dealing with social and environmental change, reducing inequality, really important areas to ensure kind of our future. Some of these are actually really interesting to think about from a historical perspective. We have things like developing countries have to worry about rapid urbanization. But if we think about the Viking Age, for example, we can actually look and establish a little bit of a deep time context to some of these, because of course the Viking Age is the birth of urbanization in Scandinavia. And that urbanization process is very rapid, and people have to deal with a whole variety of logistical challenges around that urbanization process. And so while the way that we might tackle those problems is going to be different today, we can look to the past and kind of think about how people have approached these same issues at different periods. But I think the other thing that we should always remember with this kind of stuff is that history is, of course, constantly retold in all sorts of really complicated and sometimes very political sorts of ways. And I think understanding it better, whether that's through a hobby sort of interest or whether that's through kind of professional scholarship, helps to maybe minimize misappropriations and misuses of history. Of course, one of the big things here recently has been a lot of discussions about empire around things like the Brexit debate. It's important to remember that history is sometimes not told in its full nuance. And I think the third and most important, actually, reason that studying history is it makes us better people. If we think about history in its full nuance, if we kind of key in on the individuals who lived that history, we can cultivate more empathy. We can understand the way that different people have existed throughout time and continue to exist today. And I think the world needs a little more empathy.
So, Keith, you have a really good grasp on history and why we need to study history. Is history something you have enjoyed since you were young?
Yeah, I think that's true. I have had an interest in the medieval period fairly generally from a pretty young age. Kind of grew up reading a lot of it just out of interest. Really didn't think about making a career out of it. But yeah, one thing kind of led to another, and I've just gotten a whole lot of really great opportunities to kind of keep pursuing it, and I hope that continues.
Now, looking back at the Viking Age specifically, Keith, how do we learn so much about a culture that existed 1,000 years ago? Because as I understand it, there's not an enormous amount of archaeological evidence around. So how do we know so much? Or actually, do we know so much? Is what we know accurate?
Well, I think that's always an interesting question. I mean, there's always interpretation and reinterpretation that needs to be done with scholarship. We're always kind of going back over things to try to refine and make sure that our views are consistent and that they're well rooted in the evidence. But the evidence that we do have comes from a whole variety of different kind of sets of things. Of course, one of the biggest challenges when thinking about the Viking Age is that the texts that exist from this period, by and large, are not actually by Scandinavians about Scandinavians. So we tend to have a very a very particular view of the events of the Viking Age. Quite often, these are things like historical documents, chronicles, these sorts of things. And they tend to be written by the people who were kind of engaging with Viking-ish sorts of people abroad. And so there's kind of all sorts of different slants to these things. There's an issue of these are people who are writing in a language that is, of course, not Old Norse. And so we have a bunch of methodological challenges when it comes to interpreting the events that are recorded in these sorts of things. Think like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is a good example for something that documents the Viking Age, but doesn't necessarily give us a perspective of the people by the people who are engaging in these sorts of activities. We do have some texts that exist kind of by Scandinavians about Scandinavians. These are things like runic inscriptions and a little bit of skaldic poetry, for example. But these tend to lack the context that we would really want to really dive into them. And so there's a whole other set of methodological problems when dealing with Viking Age texts themselves. And then we have things like archaeology. There's a good amount of archaeology out there. There's all sorts of different types of archaeology as well. We have things like structures. There's the remnants of houses and things like this. We have, of course, mortuary archaeology, material culture, these kind of stray finds that get cataloged. And then, of course, the kind of pollen samples and the kind of more scientific bioarchaeological material that requires interpretation as well. And again, all of these things come with their own sets of methodological challenges. A lot of the archaeology requires interpretation, and the thing that we turn to when doing that interpretive work tends to be text, among other things. Things like sagas or laws, for example, but these are medieval documents then, and so we're walking those backward in time. That requires its own set of kind of careful work as well. So there's a lot of different evidence around, and working with it requires different skills. But by working carefully, all of this different material can allow us to build up the layers of nuance that we get to see in this period, and we can do quite a lot with it.
You mentioned language a couple of times now, and also that your route into this area of study was through learning Swedish initially. Can you tell me a bit about the importance of learning a Scandinavian language, and then the importance of Old Norse in putting some of this historical evidence into context?
Right. I mean, language is really, really important. It's how we view and interpret the world. And so thinking about language, thinking about the way that people express themselves, the way that people render concepts is kind of essential. For the modern Scandinavian language side of things, I think it's really important to be able to at least embarrass yourself in a modern Scandinavian language when doing this kind of scholarship, because it allows you to read more scholarship. Of course, not everything is published in English, so we do need to read around the subject in a variety of different languages. But then Old Norse is really essential when thinking about the Viking Age, because these are the ways it's the language that allows us to access the semantics and the concepts that these people were using to talk about themselves. So, for instance, people tend to think of Vikings as kind of marauding barbarians doing terrible things, all of this kind of stuff. And even if we get a more nuanced view of maybe some trading happening, some exploration happening, one of the last things that people tend to associate with Vikings or the Viking Age is law. But the English word law comes via Old Norse, lög, which it designates not only law, but also a region that adheres to that particular law. We can add layers to that nuanced picture of the Viking Age by thinking about language. There's all sorts of different words and concepts and phrases that we can slowly explore if we've got enough command of the language to dive into those waters.
That's really interesting. And, growing up in Britain, I certainly had a very narrow view on the Viking Age, which was mainly about Lindisfarne and Danelaw. Those were the two things I really remember. But when having lived here for many years now, and I read the material published here about the Vikings, those two things are not really mentioned, because, of course, Danelaw is called Danelaw because those Vikings, as I understand it, came from what is now modern-day Denmark. And the Lindisfarne raids are not really talked about that much here either. And you get a whole different perspective on the Vikings in Norway, about the farming and the communities and the rivalries within Norway, which I never knew about when I was growing up in the UK.
Yeah, so, I mean, interestingly, like, here's a place where we can explore the language a little bit more. So the common word for Old Norse in Old Norse is not actually related anything to Norse. It's the Danish tongue. That's what Swedes call it. That's what Danes call it. That's what Norwegians call it. That's what Icelanders, it's recorded in Icelandic as well. And so the term Dane is a little bit of a catch-all in this particular period. And so the people who are coming to raid and then settle in the area that comes to be known as the Danelaw, in which I am currently sat, Actually, they are a diverse group of Scandinavians. For example, we know that various kings of Norway engage in raiding activity in Ireland and the British Isles as well. And it's unlikely that they would be specified as Norwegians. They tend to be discussed in very general sorts of terms.
And of course, the countries as we know them today didn't exist back then. It was a much more complex arrangement.
Yeah.
Okay,
it's all broken into kind of regional distinctions, actually. And so even Norway, the concept of Norway seems to kind of float in during the Viking Age. But it's the regional distinctions that are actually more important. The people of the Gulathing, for example, in kind of Western Norway, are kind of constantly separate from those of the Frostathing or the Borgathing or the Eidsivathing. And this distinction actually continues all the way into the medieval period. These regional differences are recorded in things like our medieval laws. So yeah, the national idea, of course, doesn't exist in the Viking Age. It's really these proto-nations are just starting to get going, but the regional distinctions are much more important.
Okay, so Keith, I grew up in the East Midlands, not a million miles away from Nottingham, and you're based there now with a centre for the study of the Viking Age, and you've already sent me a web link of a blog or a website about Viking Age in the East Midlands, and this wasn't something I was necessarily aware of growing up. As I said, I heard about Lindisfarne and a couple of other places. So what does the Centre for the Study of the Viking Age actually do? Is it focused on Nottingham and the surrounding area, or are you looking at all aspects of the time period?
So we have a very broad field of interest when it comes to studying the Viking Age. We're an interdisciplinary research centre housed in the School of English at the University of Nottingham. We kind of attack the Viking Age, if you will, from all sorts of different angles. There's runologists who work under the CSVA. There's people like me who work more on the social aspects of the Viking Age. We've got all sorts of expertise in language and text. We have partners in our in the Department of Archaeology at the university. And we have a really interesting kind of group of scholars working on things like names and naming. And that work can very localized, thinking about the way that the landscape here in the East Midlands was shaped by Viking Age activity. Or it can be much further afield. My interests, for example, tend to be in Scandinavian law in the Viking Age and the medieval period. And so that obviously takes me much further away than here in Nottingham and the East Midlands. We have also a whole cohort of PhD students who are exploring all sorts of different topics, from the Viking Age activity in the East, in Rus, to things like social network theory in Icelandic texts, to medieval Icelandic romance and its connections, its kind of intercultural connections with things like Middle English. So we have like a really broad approach to the Viking Age and its aftermath. We also kind of look at the different ways that people continue to engage with the Viking Age and Viking Age materials well into the medieval period, and in some public engagement work even later. So we're kind of interested in this very broad idea of the Viking Age and Viking diasporas, which is something that our director, Professor Judith Yesh, spends her time writing about. She's got this great book from 2015 on the topic.
That's interesting. On that topic, especially as you mentioned, your specialism is in social aspects. I don't think it's unfair to say that the Viking Age has never been as popular as it is now. I'm thinking in terms of Vikings series. Yeah. And also, I don't know if you've seen Be Foreigners, a Norwegian production that's just recently hit the streaming services that also features Viking culture heavily.
Yeah.
What do you make of these productions? Do you watch them and find them entertaining, or are you picking holes in the accuracies? Or what are some of the things these shows get right and get wrong?
Well, so I mean that's a really complicated question. I think so much of those sorts of productions are geared towards entertainment, and that's important. We need to entertain ourselves. We need cultural productions that speak to our current experiences and our current ways of thinking about the world. But we engage with this question quite a lot with our first year undergraduates. Historical accuracy doesn't necessarily make something boring, but if we also think about the Viking Age itself, these are people who told stories in ways that weren't historically accurate either. So, for instance, some of the Eddic poetry that seems to date from potentially the Viking Age recalls things like Attila the Hun. But the stories are definitely not rooted in history. They're rooted in Viking Age ways of thinking about things, or early medieval ways of thinking about things. And so in some ways, these sorts of productions are kind of continuations of that sort of practice. And that makes them fun to engage with, fun to think about. But especially when you've kind of spent so much time worrying about historical accuracy and thinking carefully about setting these things in a nuanced framework. I mean, there's a lot that these sorts of shows don't get right. But I think one of the most important things about these sorts of shows is when they add a little bit of humor, when they add a little bit of humanity to the narrative. People in the Viking Age were just people. They laughed, they cried, they loved, they lost. I mean, these human elements to the stories, I think, are actually probably the most important bits. Because again, it helps us to maybe cultivate a little bit more of that historical empathy, which I think is really, really important when approaching the past.
Keith, while we're on this topic, I have to ask you about the horned helmet thing of the Vikings. As I understand it, Vikings didn't have horned helmets. Is that true or not?
Vikings did not have horned helmets. This one is an easy myth to bust. It's actually really, you can trace it back through the historical record, and it really doesn't go very far. It goes to Richard Wagner's costume designer, who put together this really dramatic horned helmet for opera production. And it fits really interestingly with what we were talking about with historical accuracy and uses and misuses of the past in different ways. Wagner kind of famously, as part of the whole National Romanticist movement, tried to kind of maybe uncritically strip away some of the distinctions and the chronological distances between different historical groups of European peoples, and conflated a lot of, for instance, Celtic material with Scandinavian material, with German material, and all of these different influences, and they all get kind of mixed up in his productions, and you can see that with the horned helmets. There are Bronze Age helmets with horn-like appendages on them, but of course these are Bronze Age. They relate to a different cultural context. They relate to entirely different groups of people. And so, yeah, it's something that has kind of bled into the popular cultural imagination of Vikings. But yeah, it has no leg to stand on when it comes to the Viking Age itself. Plus, I mean, there's all sorts of arguments about kind of ornate, intimidating headwear. But personally, I think anybody who would be in a sort of combat scenario wouldn't want big old things hanging out the side of their heads that somebody can either hit or grab onto. I mean, it's logistically, it doesn't make a ton of sense. So, and the Vikings were intensely pragmatic people. I don't think the horned helmet really is something we can expect to find in the archaeology anytime soon.
But they do make great souvenirs from the shops on Karl Johans gate in Oslo.
They're great souvenirs, and it's part of the public imagination of what a Viking is. I mean, if you see a horned helmet, you're going to think Viking, even if you're somebody who works on the period academically. I mean, it's just a very effective symbol for that.
You mentioned that one of the biggest questions that you pose to students in the first year is about just this. So as students progress through the courses and your more senior researchers as well, what are the questions you're looking at now with the position we're in, with the archaeological evidence we found and so on? What are the questions that we're still trying to find answers to?
Well, I think again that differs from person to person in all sorts of different ways. We also do a lot of public engagement work with the center. So we have like children come in and we hold workshops, and sometimes they have burning questions on the most basic level, like, did the Vikings exist? And so we get to point to all sorts of different things around us here in the East Midlands to demonstrate that. And that's always really good fun. When it comes to our undergraduates, they tend to come with questions about identity, things like status, things like gender. How did people wrestle with these things in the past? When it comes to our PhDs and the staff members who work on these things kind of full time, we've got our own kind of burning questions in each of our specialisms. But I think one of the areas that we're probably going to see more and more work on in coming years is going to be Viking Age connections to the east and to the south. We have these trade routes through parts of Central Eurasia that we know existed. We have these trade routes that go all the way down to Constantinople and Baghdad. And there's this huge flow of Islamic dirhams into Scandinavia during the Viking Age. And then across kind of Europe as well in association with Viking activity. And there's an awful lot of questions left unanswered about how these contacts were established, what they looked like over the course of the whole period of the Viking Age, how relationships were maintained, how people communicated with each other, of course, because we're talking sometimes many languages changing over the course of these trade routes. So there's all sorts of really interesting questions on that eastern side of things, and there's some fantastic work being done on it right now, both here in the center and more widely in the field. But it's those sorts of questions that I think are going to occupy the field in some really interesting ways going forward.
Do you have any connections with institutes here in Scandinavia?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got partnerships through various research projects, either on an individual level for specific staff members, or as the center, more broadly. Um, we do have kind of connections with University of Oslo. Um, we have kind of a partnership with the University of Bergen, where we send some of our students every year to as a delegation to a postgraduate symposium there every year to share research and kind of get feedback from colleagues in the wider field. So yeah, we've got partnerships all over the place. It's one of the nice things about working in this area is it's a real interesting community of scholars, and it's a fairly small field, so people tend to know each other, and it means that you're kind of constantly building relationships and maintaining those relationships. And any chance you get to collaborate, I think people really take the time and the energy to do that. It's a nice field to work in because of that.
Excellent. So speaking of collaboration, have you travelled to visit any of these institutions in Scandinavia or any of the famous Viking sites around the region?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the travel side of it is really important because you need to see things in the landscape to understand kind of the impact of people living these histories. I was a Gestdoktorand at Uppsala and Stockholm during my PhD. So really enjoy going out there. I have some colleagues there who are always fun to chat with, and I always come away inspired and thinking about things in new ways. But also Oslo is fantastic. It's great to meet up with colleagues there, chat, and just kind of see the region, understand how people got on together, and kind of take that home and do some thinking and reflecting and channel that into your work.
Excellent. Well, Keith, we are almost out of time, but before we go, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what the centre offers in terms of undergraduate and postgraduate study, and then any public access avenues that are available.
Absolutely. So we have our staff members contributing to the undergraduate program at the School of English at the university. We teach 3 kind of broad Viking studies sorts of courses under that remit. But the center itself is, of course, a research center. And so that has kind of a specific master's program associated with it. And we have our PhDs as well, of course. So the center itself tends to focus more on that research side of things. But we're kind of always contributing to all sorts of activity within the school more broadly. When it comes to the kind of outreach sort of work that we do, we have called Vikings for School. We have students come to the university, have a chat with both our undergraduate students and our postgraduate students. It's a student-led program, which is fantastic. And we get to connect up-and-coming researchers in this field with kids with all these fantastic burning questions, and we get them thinking about Viking Age history as local history, but also Viking Age history as kind of global history. We have all of these fantastic finds that have connections all over the place. So yeah, I've passed you that link to our East Midlands Vikings project. As part of this, we have this fantastic digital museum experience where you can click through and examine all sorts of really high quality images of objects that have been found across the East Midlands. These are kind of curated by professionals within the center here. And there's also a whole variety of talks on the Viking Age that you can find on there, and all sorts of extra resources and blog posts. And it's just a great way, especially in these Corona times, to connect with some history, connect with some heritage. And then, of course, we have our social media profiles on Twitter, which people can happily find us at.
Sure, and I will include links to everything you've described, including the excellent website on the East Midlands and your social media profiles in the show notes, which anyone can find at lifeinnorway.net/podcast. Keith, you've been to Norway, it sounds like. So I normally ask my guests, who are almost always people living in Norway, of course you're not, where their favourite part of the country is. So what's been your favourite experience of visiting Norway so far?
I do really like Oslo. It's a beautiful city. You've got easy access to the mountains. You've got the water. And I've got some great friends there. So that's my favorite.
Excellent. Keith, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great speaking.
Thanks, David. It's been really fun. Thanks so much.